history of your family and how the different people got together, stories that I know. I'm going to start going backwards and then move forward, okay? So the first story that I'll tell is the story of your grandmother and your great-grandmother and your great-grandfather. It was Audrey Lamar Shipley and Marshall Allen Smith. Audrey Lamar was living with her mother. Her mother had been married several times, and they were kind of just hopping from place to place. And when she got to be in the 3rd grade, she had never went to school, and they moved to a little town called Marietta, Texas, where her mother, Moody, had family members. At that time, my grandfather, which is your great-grandfather, Marshall Smith, lived in Marietta. His family had lived in Marietta for several generations, and basically his father, Fred, had owned the town. Fred and Katie. He had lots of land, lots of money, and so my grandfather, Marshall, your great-grandfather, had food to eat. They met at the elementary school. She started in the little 1st grade class because she had never been to school, and then every day or so they moved her up to the grade till she got into 4th grade. And she said that she was very happy because she was kind of upset when she was walking by all the people that were so much shorter than her. Granny Audrey was. So when she got to her right grade, she was happy. But that very, very first week in school, she noticed my grandfather, your great-grandfather, Marshall, because it was during the Depression, and everyone had just like biscuits for their lunches. They would bring some bread, a butter biscuit or something like that. Well, my grandfather, Marshall, always brought not only a biscuit, but a piece of ham or bacon, something like that. So he always had a biscuit and meat. And my grandmother, at that time, she was about 8 or 9, looked at him and she said, "I'm going to marry him because he always has meat to eat, and I want to be able to eat meat every day if I want to." Well, lo and behold, I'm not sure exactly when they actually quote-unquote started dating, but eventually they did marry. And what's interesting is your great-great-grandmother, Moody, married a man called Granddaddy Mac is what we called him. His name was McKinley, and he was her 5th husband, and they were in a double wedding with my grandmother and my grandfather. So your great-great-grandmother Moody double married with your grandmother Audrey and Marshall. Shipley was her first husband that she had Granny Audrey with, but he never had anything to do with her afterwards because he would try to come see her and would send letters and stuff, but Granny Moody would burn them and throw them away. So she never allowed her to be with her dad ever, because her name kind of described her at Moody. She was a very unkind lady. So Granny Audrey and Marshall got married. He went away to the war, World War II, and he was in the Pacific, I think they call it realm, and she moved to Texarkana, which is about an hour from their little town of Marietta, and she was one of what you would call a Rosie the Riveter. She got a job in the ammunitions plant, and she made bombs, and basically it was she lived with another woman, a lot of women, and just a few men that were there that were their age that usually had issues like maybe asthma or something is the reason they couldn't be in the war. And she spent a lot of time dancing. She loved to go out and dance and working. I think she actually really enjoyed her time there. But then my grandfather came back. He got a job at Red River Armory, so he continued making arms there. And when the men came back, the women lost their jobs, so Granny Audrey lost her job. They moved back to Marietta, and they had my uncle Mike, and 18 months later they had your grandfather William Joel Smith. They built their house while she was pregnant with my dad, your grandfather Joel. So she was pregnant and building a house, and Marshall was building the house and working. So they lived there their entire lives, from the time they built the house when my dad was in the womb to the time that my grandfather died. And then about a year before my grandmother died, Granny Audrey, she lived there also, and then she was taken to a nursing facility her last year of her life. And she built onto the house. She did all the plumbing. She did everything. The two of them, he worked at Red River Armory until he retired. He retired really young, like at 55, because he had the war benefits and that. And then they would travel around in a trailer and did stuff that way. Also had a little house down by the lake where they would go. They had cows and horses at different times. They had a chicken coop for a while, which was really gross and smelly. They pretty much hated that. My grandmother got her license to be able to cut hair, so she was a beautician and built a little beauty shop at the back of the house. But truth be told, she wasn't very good at it, but it was a nice little gossip place. I was the first grandchild born to her. But let's go. So then you know how Joel Smith came about. And then he had one more sister, Pam. So that was their family. Pam and Joel and Mike were the children of Marshall and Audrey. And Audrey was the child of Moody, and I'm not sure what her dad's name was, but it was Shipley. But the other mother was Moody Lamar, and that's how she got her middle name, as Audrey Lamar Shipley. My grandfather, Marshall Allen Smith, was the child of Fred and Katie Smith. And Katie was alive when I was born, probably until I was about 8 or 9, so I remember her. So let's scoop over to your grandma's side, my mom. My mom's name is Glenda. Now, her story is very interesting if you go back to her parents. Her parents are Jewel Williams. JC is what he liked to be called, because he didn't like to be called Jewel. And Beulah Pierce Williams when she married him. But they weren't each other's first marriage either. My grandfather, Joel Smith, was married to a woman named Ruby. So she was Ruby and he was Jewel, so that was really sweet. And from what I understand, they had a really lovely marriage. And they got married when he was a little older anyways, because he worked as a cowboy out in West Texas for a while. Came back to East Texas. He married he married Ruby, and they had 4 boys. And one afternoon, Sunday afternoon, they decided to just go on a Sunday afternoon car ride like people would do in the country. So they were all in the car, and a drunk driver hit their car. Immediately, Ruby was killed. All of the children were okay, except for one got hurt pretty bad, but I can't remember which one did. He ended up okay also. But they assumed my grandfather was going to die, so they took him to the hospital and just kind of laid him there. And he had broken hips and femurs and things like that, and they didn't set them because they assumed he would die. Well, he ended up not dying, so then by the time they set him, they had to re-break them. Anyways, it was really bad. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He was in the hospital for 6 months, 7, 8 months, quite a long time, recuperating. He had 3 sisters that took his boys under their wings, and the 4 boys went to live with his sisters that were around there. At the same time of all this was happening, your great-grandmother Beulah, whose father was a man who was a fire and brimstone preacher, she had ran away from that basically lifestyle because she was a little bit wild. We could tell stories if you want me to about how wild she was, but she met this guy from California named something Clark. So she married this guy, and she had one son with him, Carl. And then when she was pregnant with the second son, Danny, he beat her up, and it was miserable. And she divorced him, and she moved back after she had Danny. She divorced him and moved back to Texas. So both of them were living in Dangerfield, Texas, which is about 25 miles from Marietta, where your grandfather Joel was living. Well, so she had 2 boys, and my grandfather had 4 boys, and this was in the 40s, late 40s. And so she needed a husband, and he needed a wife, and she was working as a waitress at a local diner or whatever, and he would see her walking by, and she was pretty, and he needed a mother for his children. So the 2 of them got married, and they had 1 child together, which was your grandmother, Glenda. So there were 6 boys, all from different marriages, and then the one from their marriage, which was my mother, Glenda. Well, they stayed married until my grandfather died, but it was a horrible, horrible, horrible marriage. Your grandfather, Jewel, or JC, even though he was a hard worker, he was an alcoholic, and your grandmother, Beulah, was crazy and abusive, but only to your grandmother, my mother, Glenda. So she abused her terribly. She would, whenever the boys would do something bad, she would basically come to your grandma's bedroom and beat her up and talk about how ugly and terrible and awful she was. And that's why even today at 60, we still have to work on her self-esteem, because she is such a wonderful, fantastic person. It makes me upset that this woman did that to her. But looking back at knowing about what her father was like, I'm pretty sure that that's the way that she was treated also. And also knowing now about different stuff, I'm pretty sure she was mentally ill with like some type of disorder. Just past somebody got pulled over for driving while black. Sorry, dude. Now, the next thing that happened was, they had their children, and the 4 boys that were my grandfather's children continued to try to stay mainly with their aunts and grandma for the same reason, because it was really kind of a volatile place to be. And my mother was there with her abusive mother, and Danny and Carl, which were her other 2 brothers, they were vile people. And so basically she lived in a horribly abusive house. All of the brothers lied about their age so they could go to Vietnam early, if that tells you how bad it is. Well, when my mother was 15 or 16, she met my dad. So Glenda met Joel at a dance somewhere in Rocky Branch. That was the name of the town. There was a dance in Rocky Branch, and it was with, the guy, the Eagles guy. I can't remember his name right now, but he used to play there too, because he's from Linden, which is right by there. So he would play dances. They would go to dances. Well, my mother's best friend was kind of easy, and my dad had heard about her, and so when they walked in, my dad was kind of interested in her. Her name was Pat, and he was like, oh, I heard about Pat, she's easy. But then he saw your grandmother, and he fell in love with her because she's so sweet and kind. And I don't know how long they dated until she was 16 and he was 19 when they got married. And just a few months later, I came along. It was a very, very small wedding. And at the time, since my mother was still in high school, I think she was a junior then, if you were pregnant, you weren't allowed to go to school. So basically, if you were a young pregnant woman, and they decided you could have no education. So they kicked her out of school, so she got her GED. She's probably one of the smartest people you know. So she went ahead and got her GED. It was no big deal for her. And then the 2 of them began their life together with a baby, with both of them just having a very backwoods education. Your dad, your grandpa, Joel, was kind of a hellion, so in school they just decided he probably wasn't going to go to college, so they put him in all the classes that didn't get you ready for college. Well, once I was born, he was a hard worker, so he got a job at this coal place where they would get inside of like railroad cars that were full of coal, and then they would shovel the coal out or whatever. And he was 19, and he looked to one side of him and he saw a 40-year-old man, and he looked to the other side of him and he saw a 40-year-old man, and he thought, oh hell no, I'm not going to do this for the rest of my life. So he decided to go back to school. So his education was so poor, he had to take the courses that you take when you are basically they're getting you ready for college classes. They're the remedial classes at college. And so he took those and he did exceptionally well. He did so well, as a matter of fact. By the way, he had to read every single one of his books with a dictionary beside him because he had no idea what most of the words meant in the books he was reading. So he did really well at the junior college that he was going to, and he got accepted into the University of Texas at Austin. For the first semester, he went down there by himself. And then the next semester, my mom and I both went down there with him. And that's where he graduated from undergrad school. He graduated in the very, very top of his class. And he got a job with one of the big eight, in accounting, one of the big 8 accounting firms in Dallas. Then he got a job almost immediately. Rockwell International kind of latched onto him, and he got a job there. We had been there a few years. Then my sister was born. I was about 8, and then my sister was born. And at Rockwell, they offered him a really large promotion. Well, he had always wanted to be an attorney because he felt like the little man always got screwed, because he had seen like things happen to his parents, like when he had gotten a wreck when he was in high school. He was like, wait a minute, people are taking advantage of them because they don't know their rights. So he wanted to be the person that fought for the people against the big companies and insurance companies and stuff like that. But he had never felt like he could be a lawyer because he didn't think he was smart enough. Well, after going to college and stuff, he realized, I bet I could do this. So he wanted to get his CPA. So before he left, as a matter of fact, it was like when he was in his first year of law school, he also got his CPA. So he's CPA certified. But he went to my mom when he got to Rockwell, and he had been there for a while, and Rockwell offered him a huge promotion, which would have been worth a lot of money. And he said, listen, we can take this job. I'll be an accountant with Rockwell. I'll be managing people. I'll be making lots of money. It's basically a step towards being one of the top people here. Or we could go back to school and be completely broke again, because I would really love to be an attorney. And my mother said, okay, we'll go and be an attorney. So the 4 of us, because it was my mom and my dad and Amanda and I, moved to Fayetteville, Arkansas, where my dad got his law degree. And then after he got his law degree, he moved back down to Texas and moved to Longview, which is about an hour from where his parents and my mom's parents lived. So we were in a little larger city. It's about 100,000 people. So you can have a nice practice at the same time of being close to family, because that's very important to us. So that's the story of how I came about. Then the story of your father and I, Jerry and I moved to Lubbock to go to school. I'd went to UT since I was the first 2 years, UT Austin. And then I decided that I wanted to go somewhere further away from East Texas, because I was having issues with another guy that I wanted to get away from. And so I said, well, I can stay in Texas and pay in-state tuition, so I'm going to move to Texas Tech, because I had a friend that was going to Texas Tech. And there was this place called Campus Advance, which was the church hangout place for the people that went to college there. And your dad, Jerry, was in an acting group there, and he and I both started this acting, we're in this acting group together, and we just hit it off and started dating and fell in love. At the time, I was dating him and the other guy, but they both knew I was dating both of them. And then your dad asked me to marry him about, let's see, we met in September, gosh, it was maybe July. So less than a year after we had been dating, he asked me to marry him. And then we got married the next January. So it was pretty quick, I guess. And your dad hadn't finished school, but I had, so we stayed there while he finished school. He had about a year or two. And then I got pregnant with Zach. I was working as a buyer for a department store. And then I got pregnant with Zach. And I did not like being so far away from my mommy. Because I was staying at home because your dad then went to work. And we moved to Longview so I could be close to my family. We decided, your dad worked and I stayed home, so that was hard financially. Then when Zach was about 4, we found out we were pregnant with you, and we were at first a little like, oh my gosh, because we had just planned to have one child. And then as I got used to the situation, got more and more excited, and I can't even imagine life without you, because you are so awesome and wonderful to be with, and interesting and incredible. So God really took care of me by giving you to me. Thank you, God. And that is how you came to be. And we never left Longview, and you went to Hallsville your whole life, and we took you to Church of Christ, and we tried to do right by you, but you think that we were horrible for raising you in Hallsville and taking you to church. But we really were trying to be the best parents possible, and sorry that you think that we screwed up so badly. But hopefully you can live your own life the way you want to now, and everything will be happy for you. Now, going backwards to your daddy, now where did your daddy come from? I don't know as much about his life. I know through his mother. Okay. So Sandra is your dad's mother, your grandmother, and her mother and father were Andersons. And I cannot remember either one of their names. I only met his mother his grandmother twice, because they lived in Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix, Arizona is where your grandmother was born, and where Jerry was born. Jerry was born to Sandra and Larry Egan, and Larry's parents lived in Montana. So I'm not sure how he got to Arizona. But it was the same thing, same about Vietnam. So before he left for Vietnam, or right after he got back from Vietnam, or he went to Vietnam after Jerry was born, I get kind of confused because they don't like to all talk about the facts of it. But he went to 2 or 3 tours in Vietnam, and then he came home, and I think that's when they had Jerry. So he had Jerry, and then a few years later he had a brother named Michael. He decided he wanted to be a preacher. Larry did. So they went to Lubbock, and in Lubbock he went to Sunset School of Preaching and got his preaching certificate, or whatever you get for being a preacher. And they went to Flagstaff, Arizona, back to Arizona, and he was a preacher in Flagstaff, Arizona. Well, a little bit before that, your grandmother Sandra's sister died on Christmas Eve. It's horrible. And she had 2 children, Renee and Donald. So they took them in, adopted them, and took them into their house. So then it was Jerry, Renee, Donald, and Michael. And when your dad was 10 years old, so I think 4th or 5th grade, I'm pretty sure 5th grade, something happened that made her take the children that day that she found out about everything and moved them all to Lubbock because she had made friends while they were in the school there. And that's how she ended up back in Lubbock. And basically, your father has never seen his father again since he was 10 years old. One time when he was like 12 or something, his mother made him call his dad and ask for money for cleats or something. I don't know. And then once when Michael, Jerry's brother, was going into the military, they got a letter from him about the military. And then once, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, your dad got a letter from him. But he lives in, we think in Phoenix or something. We're not actually sure. But even if your dad had any type of relationship with him, like just chatting or whatever, he would have never been allowed to be with y'all or around y'all. It's basically bad apple. How the two of them met, I don't know. And Jerry is actually named after Larry's best friend who died in Vietnam. That's how Jerry got his name. He was named after him. So, as far as I can tell, going backwards, and I can look a little further back if you would like, but basically that's the story of your parents meeting, your grandparents meeting, and on my side, your great-grandparents meeting. I know that Moody, so we talk about your great-grandmother and your great-great-grandmother and stuff. I know that Moody's mother, which I can't remember her name, but she was married 3 times, and that was before the turn of the century. So I think she was a little bit of a wild woman too. So anyways, that's the end of our tale of how you came to be.